In the early days of Storytime, this series was dedicated to the abject failures of Formula 1, your people like your Andrea Modas, Lifes, 40s, and so on. But over the years, I've come to look at drivers and teams who had very long and distinguished careers, even if they were a little bit under the radar. Insert driver here, because what will happen here is I will name some and then I'll get told off that I didn't name the one that a particular person was thinking of. But Johnny Herbert and Martin Brundle are the two that I'll always go for, considering the injuries they sustained in their early careers, and I will get around to doing a video on both of them at some point. Then, when it comes to the journeymen of recent years, I guess you've got the likes of Nico Hülkenberg, who has been around the block a lot of times. I don't think there are many drivers who have had 2 or more spells at one team, given that he's had 3 spells at Sauber, and he had 2 spells at Force India/Racing Point. But in the 1980s, the journeyman career was usually attributed to a driver who just couldn't get a break at a top team, for whatever reason. Roberto Moreno is one, and another driver I've looked at in the past is Stefano Modena, who seemed to have the talent but never really got his break in a top team. Racing for the likes of Tyrrell and co back in the late 80s and early 90s wasn't exactly going to get anybody anywhere. And I always say the same thing about Brundle as well. Zakspeed, Ligier, Brabham, Tyrrell, you're not doing anything in those cars. And when he got to Benetton, his teammate was Michael Schumacher, whom Benetton were very interested and invested in. When he got to McLaren, they were in that dull run of form and they had those iffy Peugeot engines. But we'll get to all of that when we eventually get round to it. He's not just some failed driver who became a pundit. Put some respect to Martin Brundle's name. But that was the thing about Formula 1 in the 1980s and then into the early 1990s. The back of the grid could be just as colourful and attractive as the front of the grid. Teams that were barely making it into the top 26 and cars held together with nothing but hopes, dreams and whatever sponsorship money the drivers could bring with them. With other methods of raising money as well, the secret ingredient is crime. Ponzi schemes, fraud, people connected to some of Europe's nastiest men. It's all been done at some point. But some of these colourful personalities do end up achieving something, even if it is very brief. And just like Roberto Moreno, this particular man was in it simply for the love of the game. Another episode of Storytime I've been meaning to do for a very long time, and that is Michele Alboreto. Alboreto was quite the unassuming driver, and by that I mean when you look into his background. Because he wasn't a rich kid like Elio De Angelis, he wasn't the son of a former driver, nor was he otherwise related to another driver. He was just this kid from Milan, who once stood at the side of the Monza circuit watching cars go by and went, I want to do that. After getting into motorsport through meeting 2 men called Pippo Bianchi and Pippo Casconi, he started racing for a lower formula outfit called Scuderia Salvetti. Scuderia Salvetti was running in a low-level category of Italian single-seaters, with the cars running the 500cc engine lifted out of a Fiat 500. And apologies if I can't give you a picture of any of these things, but I'm sure if you use Google you can find some later on. But either way, this category started in the mid-1960s and would run exclusively on the junior circuit at Monza. The series was called Formula 875 Monza and was relatively cheap, with each car costing around 875,000 Italian lira at the time, which is around $3,000 today, which is about 1,700 euros, something like that. But Alboreto started in this series in 1976 at the age of 20 and moved to Italian Formula 3 3 years later. A quiet bloke outside of the car, Alboreto became something else inside the car. His driving style became so identifiable that his fellow competitors and journalists would go and stand at the Parabolica corner at Monza just to see how he was getting so much speed through there. In his second year in Formula Monza, he came 3rd in the championship, and that was enough to attract attention with which to go up into another series. When he got to Italian Formula 3 in 1979, he won at Magione, Misano and Imola, and would finish 6th overall in the European Series as well. His rise up the ranks was pretty quick, and at the same time he was doing this against names who had become quite well known. Boutsen, Fabi, Baldi, Alio, Strife, Team, Larari, Bleekemolen, some of the known names on that grid. And Eddie Jordan as well, come to think of it, although we know Eddie more as the team owner than the driver. In the 1980 European Formula 3 Championship, Alboreto won by 6 points from Boutsen, taking wins at Zeltweg, Le Châtre, Monza and Kassel. Cesare Fiorio then contacted him to drive a Lancia Monte Carlo in the World Sports Car Championship, and he finished first in class at the 6 Hours of Silverstone, before finishing second at the Giro d'Italia. 1981 was basically waiting on a Formula 1 drive, and while waiting, Giancarlo Minardi approached him with the contract for Formula 2, supplementing the driving with more sports car action, winning the World Sports Car Championship with Lancia. and one of his teammates that year was Riccardo Patrese, another man with a long career in Formula 1. In Formula 2 he'd win at Misano, and his sponsorship from an Italian count got him a drive at Tyrrell. This count, and I hope I've got the pronunciation right, Gucci Zanon, had already financed Alboreto's hero Ronnie Peterson into Formula 1. And this was the car he had that year, the Tyrrell 010. Not exactly the greatest car ever built, but it was able to score some points in the hands of Eddie Cheever, with the car in its second year of service. Alboreto was the third driver in the second car, taking over for the San Marino Grand Prix, and Ken had already seen Kevin Kogan and Riccardo Zunino have a go in it. Kogan didn't qualify at Long Beach, and Zunino had taken 2 13th places. But by the time Alboreto got in, it was a difficult start. At his first race he collided with Beppe Gabbiani, and he didn't qualify for the Spanish or German Grand Prix. His best result of the season was 9th at Zandvoort. In this time period, Tyrrells were either one of two things. They were either semi-competitive or outright crap. There was no in between. But the 1982 season was way more competitive. At Imola, where he'd had some success in the juniors, Michele was able to score his first ever F1 podium. At the final round at Caesars Palace, he took his first win. He scored a total of 25 points to finish 8th in the standings, and was the top Italian that year. In 1983, Alboreto was using the same Tyrrell, a car that was holding on despite the rapid advancement of Formula 1 around them. The turbo era was now coming into full effect, with many teams switching to turbos at the end of 1982. This being because turbos were more powerful despite the reliability, and ground effect had now been banned, so they needed to offset the lost downforce with sheer power. Tyrrell couldn't afford a turbo, so they had to persevere with the old faithful that was the DFV. At Detroit, Alboreto would get his second win for Tyrrell when Piquet's Brabham popped a tyre in the closing stages of the race. It was the last win for a naturally aspirated car until 1989, and it was also the last win for the DFV. Although Tyrrell at this point was running the DFY, the DFV successor, that particular year, although it came in a bit later in the season. That win in Detroit was his only point score of the entire year, but for 1984 he'd attracted the attention of the one man in the paddock it was very hard to attract the attention of, that being Enzo Ferrari. Michele was now at a top team that had a lot of history and a decent budget, and they were also the Constructors' Champions. While the results at Brazil and South Africa weren't great, losing the brakes at Jacarapagua and then being classified 11th at Kyalami under the 90% rule, he'd win his first race for Ferrari at Zolder, becoming the first Italian to win an F1 Grand Prix since Ludovico Scarfiotti won at Monza in 1966. The problem was reliability. The Ferrari had none. In 16 races, the Ferrari failed to finish 8 of them, but when it did finish, it scored well. Aside from South Africa, where he was classified on a technicality, he scored points at every single race he finished, with podiums coming at Austria, Monza and the Nürburgring. He also picked up half a point at Monaco through the race being cut short, and then Beloff and Tyrrell's later expulsion from the championship. That nudged him up from 7th into 6th. With those results, he was 4th overall on 30.5 points. But it was about to get better. Because in 1985 he took 2 more wins at Montreal and Hockenheim, with podiums at Brazil, Portugal, Monaco, Detroit, Silverstone and Austria. But the latter part of the season wasn't great for him, because he would be 13th at Monza, although this was another 90% job. He would then suffer 4 retirements in a row, at Spa, Brands Hatch, Kyalami and Adelaide. But the win at Hockenheim was somewhat fortuitous. He'd hit his own teammate Stefan Johansson and given Stefan a flat tyre, and then later on in the race, oil smoke was coming out the back of the Ferrari. His closest rival, Alain Prost, was suffering from brake issues and had lost power in the engine, so that kept him from challenging. But the season could have been even better for Alboreto because he'd been leading the championship until Zandvoort, and those retirements meant he'd lose the championship to Prost by 20 points. He'd been Prost's only challenger in that championship, and his engine blowing at Monza, clutch going at Spa, turbo failing at Brands Hatch, another turbo failing at Kyalami, and his transmission going at Adelaide, lost him the championship. At least, that's what a lot of people think. And in that race at Brands Hatch, when the turbo blew, he actually brought the car back to the pits and parked it in front of the Ferrari garage while the car was on fire. A lot of journalists at the time reckoned that was his way of saying, "See, look what you've done. You've just lost me the championship." In Italian. So he had to settle for second, but he was the only person who gave Prost any trouble in that season. If the reliability had been better, who knows, but he led most of the championship despite the Ferrari not being as good as the McLaren. But that was as good as it got. because in 1986 the new car wasn't as good as the previous one and was more unreliable, retiring from 9 of the 16 races with some sort of mechanical failure. His only podium of 1986 would come at the Österreich-Ring, but he needed both of the Williams cars to retire, and even then he was a lap behind Prost. 14 points and 9th in the championship was quite the slide from the previous season. But that said, Enzo Ferrari did have some positive things to say about him. He said, "My sympathies for Michele Alboreto are well known, a young man who drives so well with few errors. He is fast, his style is beautiful, and his qualities remind me of Wolfgang von Trips, and Alboreto resembles him due to his polite and serious attitude. Today, I am sure that he is among the best 6 Formula 1 drivers." It's not an exact quote because it's in broken English, but I've read it as it probably would have been said by a fluent English speaker. In 1986, he struggled to 8th before Gerhard Berger came in for 1987. Berger would win races at Japan and Australia towards the end of 1987, and that led to Ferrari putting their eggs in Berger's basket for the future, making him the number 1 driver. Michele would get podiums at Monaco, Imola and Adelaide, the latter making it a Ferrari 1-2, but even then he needed Senna's Lotus being disqualified for illegal brake ducts to be able to get there. At the end of the 1987 season, he was 19 points behind his teammate. There was one last hurrah for him though, the Ferrari 1-2 at Monza in 1988 where he came second, the race after Enzo's death and the only time the McLarens wouldn't win a race all year. But it was clear that Ferrari was more interested in Berger, and at the end of the year he decided to get out of the politics that is Ferrari and go somewhere else. At only one race all year in 1987, the French Grand Prix, would Alboreto beat Berger on track. Rumour was he was going to go to Williams, but Frank decided to sign Thierry Boutsen instead. So without a top team to go to because everything had been done so late, there was only one place he could go. Back to Tyrrell. It's at this point his career would begin freefall. He could have retired, but decided not to. And there might have been a time through 1989 that he probably should have retired. He was now 33 years old, and he'd had a decent career by all accounts. But he did carry on at Tyrrell through 1989. At Monaco, Ken told Michele that he would be driving the 1988 spec 017 because his 018 wasn't ready yet. Jonathan Palmer, the other Tyrrell driver, got the new car instead. But Alboreto did manage to beat Palmer in the race and then took a 3rd place at Mexico, but the relationship with Tyrrell was going to get worse. Because Ken had signed a deal with Camel Cigarettes, but Michele was sponsored by Marlboro. Ken told Michele to end his relationship with Marlboro, but Michele said no, so he was dumped for Jean Alesi. Then a case of turbo irony. Marlboro dumped Michele anyway and Alboreto moved to LaRousse for the second part of 1989. Who was sponsored by? Camel. He started racing for them at the German Grand Prix but couldn't score any points, as well as failing to pre-qualify at Spain while his teammate got onto the grid in 5th. He also failed to pre-qualify in Australia as well, this being on top of breaking his ribs when he cut the chicane at Hungary. The rest of his career could be considered journeyman. He'd knock about at the back end of the grid for a few more years before finally retiring from Formula 1 at the end of 1994. His 3rd team in a year and a half would be Arrows, who were about to be rebranded as Footwork, and I did a video on this a couple of years ago. He finished in the top 10 a few times, but points only paid out for the top 6 in this time period. But despite this, top 10s in and Arrows in this time was pretty good, and it was being used as a transitional era for the team. The following year, the team would acquire Porsche engines, but the package was absolutely awful. So the Porsche engines were hastily dumped for Hart, but that didn't make things any better. Mugens came in for 1992 and Michele was able to get 4 points finishes and came 7th 6 times, which was a much better return on the previous 2 years. It got him 10th in the championship in the end. Scuderia Italia would be his next destination in 1993, and if scoring points in a Footwork was going to be difficult, in a Scuderia Italia, it was going to be impossible. In 1993, the Scuderia Italia car with the chassis being built by Lola was by far the worst on the grid. It was also the only car without any driver aids. No traction control, no ABS, no active suspension, nothing. On top of this, the FIA had changed the qualifying rules, meaning out of the 26 cars, 2 wouldn't qualify. When it was discovered that the 2 cars not qualifying were usually the Scuderia Italia cars, they decided to reduce the non-qualifiers to 1, meaning every team would get at least 1 car on the grid. Michele non-qualified for 5 races and only finished 4 all season. Scuderia Italia would then withdraw from the last 2 races and merge with Minardi in time for 1994. And in 1994 it would be his final season. The season would start with him running a modified 1993 car which became a 1994 car from the Canadian Grand Prix onwards. this being around the time the FIA changed the rules to try and slow the cars down after what happened at Imola. Despite the inferior machinery, Michele would get one final point at the Monaco Grand Prix, a race overshadowed by the tributes to Senna and Ratzenberger, with Simtek and Williams only running one car, and then the major shunt for Karl Wendlinger. But he did get a 7th place in Hungary, which isn't bad by all accounts, but at the end of the year, with Minardi needing the money, he was out, to be replaced by Luca Badoa and a smattering of others. So, from Formula 1, where next? A season in DTM came for 1995, but in 1996 he had a crack at the American open wheel stuff, finishing 3rd at New Hampshire. But he only did 5 races over the course of 1996 and 1997 though, as the Indy Racing League started to take off. After the last attempts in open wheelers, it was back to sports cars and the American Le Mans series, but even then he wasn't full-time. Driving for Audi, he did get wins at Petit Le Mans and Sebring, as well as podiums at Sebring in 1999 and 2000. In 1997, teaming up with Stefan Johansson and Tom Christensen, his Audi won Le Mans, and he would also get a class podium in 1999 and 2000. But in 2001, a freak accident would shock the motorsport world. In April 2001, Audi and Alboreto had gone to the Eurospeedway in Lausitz, Germany for a test session involving the Audi R8 prototype, as preparation for the 2001 24 Hours of Le Mans. The plan was to use the main circuit for testing and then use the actual oval for top speed stuff, as they needed to get the right balance for Le Mans. They also conducted testing on a proving ground which was a bit like that place that James May maxed out the Veyron, which Audi was using for proper top speed stuff. And while on this proving ground, travelling at around 190 miles an hour, the left rear tyre on the Audi failed and caused the car to crash. The car vaulted a barrier and landed upside down, and back then, these prototypes were open cockpit. Alboreto's head struck the ground and killed him instantly. When the investigation was conducted, it was found that a screw dropped from a car on a previous test session at that same proving ground had caused the tyre to lose pressure too gradually for the car's tyre pressure monitoring system to be able to detect. Audi, in response, would develop a newer, more accurate system. This crash also came after Michele's family had begged him to stop racing because they felt it was too dangerous. It was kind of like, look, you had your fun, but do you think you could stop now? I mean, you've got 2 kids and things like that. But Michele just kept on racing simply because he loved it. This is why, in 2021, the Parabolica corner at Monza was renamed Alboreto, because it came 20 years after Michele's crash at Lausitz. In 2005, Giancarlo Fisichella dedicated his podium at Monza to Alboreto because Michele was the last Italian driver prior to Giancarlo to get a podium at the Temple of Speed. Fisi and Alboreto had also raced against each other in DTM in 1995, with Fisichella calling Michele a great person and really special. But 2001 as a whole was not a great year for racing. Dale Earnhardt was killed at Daytona in February, Bob Wallach was killed in March, and then you got Alboreto at Lausitz in April. Then, in September, there were a lot of drivers not really wanting to race following the events in New York City. Michele Alboreto was a man who clearly loved racing. He was brave enough as a young man to go to Monza in amongst the Tifosi and wave a Lotus flag for his hero and later friend, Ronnie Peterson, and he would base his own helmet on Ronnie's. He was also quite humble and humbled himself to the situations he found himself in. When he was at Ferrari, he didn't see a Ferrari, he just saw a car with 4 wheels, but was mindful of the team's history. He didn't think going back to Tyrrell was below him, and when he arrived at Audi, nobody would have ever known he was a 5-time Grand Prix winner. And in that period he raced, he was against immortals. Prost, Lauda, Senna, Rosberg, Mansell, Piquet. All of them were or were about to come world champions. For Alboreto to be sharing wins with that lot isn't to be sniffed at. The same goes for Elio De Angelis, who we looked at last week, come to think of it. On his day, he could beat absolutely anybody, and he could also get cars that probably shouldn't have been scoring points into the points. Think of it as like that golden era of tennis. Rafa Nadal, Roger Federer, Novak Djokovic, and then, in amongst them, taking 1 or 2 titles, Andy Murray. Alain Prost described him as a friendly and lovely man, as well as somebody who could be your best friend and your rival at the same time, which, in the 1980s wasn't really the thing, and it's certainly something that not a lot of drivers could do even today, but Motorsport.com said that this is probably the best way we should remember the man because, well, he did it simply for the love of the game. So then, a look at the career of Michele Alboreto, a man who raced simply for the love of the game and a man who often goes under the radar due to the sheer star power of some of his contemporaries in the 1980s. If this has been a fun look through the motorsport history books, then do give the video a like so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help with the picture purchasing piggy bank or otherwise keeping the lights on, then there'll be a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and any other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks for one and done donations, and memberships for those that want to Patreon, but without going to Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.